All right, we're live to tape, so welcome back again from spring break, and welcome to our Monday morning plenary. We're going to resume these until the end of term, and I want to cover today a very important thinker in Western philosophy. His name is Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T. Have any of you heard the name Kant before? In any context whatsoever? I've just put his name in the chat room. Have any of you encountered this name? You have, Randy, okay. In a philosophy class or in some other context? Probably a philosophy class, I would think. Kant's reputation is he is a great rationalist, and many think of him as the greatest rationalist since Plato, if not the greatest of all. And so he's definitely committed to the powers of the mind. He lived, for the most part, in the 18th century, died in the early 19th. In order to understand Kant's ethics, which is what we're going to do today and Thursday for my breakout group and during the week with your own breakout groups, we're going to look at the overview of some very famous principles that he left us, or rather a famous principle called the categorical imperative. But before we dive into Kant's ethics, and that's in your textbook, the readings are available to anyone. Kant has been translated into many tongues, and it's all public domain, but the reading I'm going to refer to and the one I'm highlighted is in your text, and I'll share that screen with you momentarily. But before we come on to Kant himself, it's really vitally important to contextualize something about where, so to speak, Kant is coming from. And Kant's ethics can be said to have been written not only to defend a rationalist viewpoint of ethics. In other words, he's going to try to do what Hobbes says we don't do, namely derive our sense of good and evil from some rational feature of the mind rather than from our likes and dislikes. You remember Hobbes is very completely subjective about his ethics. He's a nominalist, saying that good and bad are just names of things we like and don't like, and there follows an ethical subjectivism, saying that, you know, what you call good is only something that you like, and that's why you call it good. What you call bad is something you dislike, and that's why you call it bad. So that's a completely subjective view. And remember, Hobbes is contradicting or refuting both Plato and Aristotle, presenting us with an early modern view, and his remedy for this problem is the social contract, right, where we have to actually give up some of our liberties in order to live in harmony, because otherwise we're going to end up being too self-interested to really care very much about others, and that's going to be a recipe for actually a lot of what we see today. I'm sorry to say, very narcissistic culture led by narcissistic leaders on both sides of the divide. I hasten to add, this is a bipartisan problem. Our political landscape is populated by narcissists who appear to be more concerned about their own self-interest, their own self-image, and their own power than anything else. I'll stop sermonizing there. But this is exactly what Hobbes warned us about. In any case, the next step is David Hume, and I'll put his name in because he's very important. And he's someone that we haven't covered, and we're going to look at him briefly this morning. We need to look at David Hume. He's also an 18th century character and a great Scottish empiricist. He's part of the British empiricist tradition. But he took Hobbes a step further, and he posed such a frightful challenge to any coherent theory of ethics or any attempt to create a coherent theory of ethics that it's really David Hume who needs to be answered, even more than Hobbes. And it's Immanuel Kant who set himself the task of trying to answer David Hume. So one, in order to really understand Kant's ethics, I believe it would be beneficial for us to take a small detour first. And Hume preceded Kant. Kant had read him and was really perturbed by what Hume had to say. And I bet that some of you this morning will be perturbed by what Hume has to say. Like any good philosopher, he's provoking us into thinking more carefully about what we assume to be the case. And in terms of ethics, he bequeaths to us a problem which Kant attempted to solve. You may, at the end of the day, like Kant's solution and agree with it, or indeed you may not. agree with it. And however you feel about Kant, I hope by the end of today you'll see his ethics as partly a reply to Hume, trying to rescue ethics from what Hume has been basically called ever since he voiced this theory. It's called ethical skepticism or moral skepticism, and you're going to see why shortly. So I just wanted to make that clear, that Kant is or can be seen as answering this terrible problem of moral skepticism that comes from Hume. So before we go to Kant to see his response, we have to obviously look at Hume to see what Kant is responding to. Okay, is everybody set to go with this? And again, I've typed David Hume into the chat room so you can read his name. I'm going to share with you just a Wikipedia page about Hume's moral skepticism, and then I'm going to offer you some examples of how his thesis will play out or will cash out in everyday life. And it is really at the core of most of the intensive political debates that are currently also, in a certain sense, tearing our civil society apart. You can see, and I'm sure after today you're going to see through the lens of Hume, why these problems are so difficult to resolve. All right? So Hume actually sheds light on why we have these problems. He's not a politician. He's a philosopher, so he's not going to attempt to solve the problems, nor would he if he were alive today. I think he'd just be saying, I told you so, and the problems we're experiencing across a spectrum of issues can mostly be seen to stem back to Hume's moral skepticism and the challenge it poses. So this is very much alive. This is a doctrine or a thesis which is not just an artifact of history, and that's what I have been trying to emphasize. I'm sure that I have some of your attention now. So let's go to Hume, and we'll look at the theory quickly, which is not difficult, and then I want to challenge you with some examples that I cooked up. It's like a cooking show. I prepared a few examples, and I will offer them to you and see what you make of them in order to understand Hume's problem. Then, once we will have done that, we'll move on to look at how Kant tries to resolve it by means of rationalism. Okay, so that's our game plan. And without further ado, then, let me attempt to share with you this screen with David Hume. And it's called the is-ought distinction. And in Hume's theory, if you want it in a nutshell, again, not difficult to state, he's telling us that it is not possible by rational means to derive an ought from an is. In other words, an ought is telling us what we should do in a particular situation. I thought that's the moral prescription, like what you ought to do, what you should do, what's the right, that we should do the right thing, whatever that may be. That's a normative prescription or a moral prescription more generically. But Hume is going to argue, quite devastatingly, that we could never derive such a moral prescription from a factual state of affairs alone. And this is what has become crystallized in ethical theory as the view of moral skepticism. Let me share it with you, and then I'll take some questions, okay, if any arise. But let's have a look at Hume first and what is called the is-ought problem. And Hume is going to argue we cannot derive ought from is. So from a particular state of affairs that is a factual state of the matter, we can never, by any rational means, derive what we ought to do about it. And that's the fundamental problem. There's a picture of David Hume. He was an atheist, got himself into a lot of trouble in his day because of atheism at a time when still most people, the overwhelming majority, were religious. So he was called the infidel because he was a materialist and saw no evidence for God's existence. But that's beside the point. Hume's guillotine is what this problem has become known as, because he's literally cutting off, as the guillotine severed heads from bodies in the French Revolution. This problem severs oughts from ises in terms of moral theory. So here's the quote, and it's very flowery Baroque language. That 1739 is right in the heyday of the High Baroque. So they wrote long sentences, but just bear with me if you want to read Hume in the original. Here it is. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I've always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary ways of reasoning and establishes the being of a god or makes observations concerning human affairs, when all of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. So in other words, Hume says suddenly from statements of fact or statements of affairs, what he calls is statements, copulative propositions, that means the verb to be, which is the copulative verb, is or are, whatever is the case, or whatever things are the case, that's a matter of fact. And then suddenly, says Hume, he finds this new assertion, ought, what ought to be or what ought not to be the case. And he says the change is imperceptible, but it is of the last consequence, meaning it's absolutely of overarching and vital importance. For as this ought, or ought not, expresses some new relation or affirmation, in other words, a moral statement, as opposed to a factual statement, 'tis necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given. For what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. You see the guillotine coming into play? He's saying that matters of fact, which are described by what is, are not in and of themselves able to lead by any deductive means to moral prescriptions about what ought to be. But he says, as authors do not commonly use this precaution, I presume to recommend it to the readers. In other words, we have to be very careful about how it is that we derive or attempt to derive an ought from an is. Again, I'll give you some examples in a moment, which will absolutely make this, I hope, crystal clear to you. But he says most authors don't do this. And he means moral philosophers. They're not doing this at all. And I am persuaded that this small attention would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality. This is what's known as British understatement. Some of you may know the British are famous for this, that they make monumentally important points, but very, very carefully understate them. Literally, that's where the phrase British understatement comes from, that this small attention, in other words, this small point, he's modestly saying if we just started paying attention to how people derive ought from is, he says, this would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality. That he is completely undermining the totality of ethics and of moral reasoning by making what he calls this small attention. And let us see that the distinction of vice and virtue is not founded merely on relations of objects, nor is perceived by reason. You see, so he's telling us that our notions of what is moral don't come from our ability to perform logical operations in the mind, nor, he says, do they come from observations. What we actually see in the world empirically is that our moral reasoning is coming from some other place, and it's got nothing to do with our capacity to exercise logic or indeed our capacity to make, shall we say, scientific observations about the world itself, including human society. So these ought statements, you should do this, you should do that, or we ought to have a law, that says X, Y, or Z. These are all normative statements, and Hume says they are not derivable from logic, nor are they derivable from observation, factual or scientific observation of the world. Do you see how shocking this is? Does anybody already see how shocking this is? And I'll give you some examples in a moment. So this apparent gap, implications, says Wiki, the apparent gap between is statements and ought statements, when combined with Hume's fork, that's the idea, Hume's fork is the idea that all of our knowledge either is a matter of logical relations of ideas or empirical observations of the world, and there's no moral kinds of prescriptions that are to be found in either of those domains. So this renders ought statements of dubious validity. In other words, where do we get these moral prescriptions from, and how seriously should we be taking them? So if the is-ought problem holds, then ought statements, in other words, moral prescriptions, do not seem to be known in either of these two ways, namely in logical relations of ideas or in observations about the world. And it would seem, therefore, that there can be no moral knowledge, because morality will therefore fall outside of the realm of epistemology. Whether you're a rationalist or an empiricist, it would appear that your moral knowledge is not coming from your ability to reason internally or indeed to reason about the world. So that is called moral skepticism, yeah? Moral skepticism. And so it looks like it's even worse than Hobbes. He's not disagreeing with Hobbes, but he's saying that what we decide to call good or bad, with our labeling, Hobbes's nominalism, his ethical subjectivism, if you like, that each of us independently assigns labels like good and bad to things we like and dislike. He's saying those likes and dislikes, Hume is saying, have nothing to do with our ability to think rationally or indeed our ability to observe factually. So it's coming from some other place. And therefore, we have really no hope of ever deriving ought from is. Okay, do you get the general thesis? I'm going to stop the share for a moment. This is what Kant is responding to. But before I give you some hard and fast examples of this in more contemporary light, so I'm going to do that in a moment, I just want to make sure that the sort of theoretical framework is clear to you. Do you understand, at least in principle, what Hume is telling us? Yes, that's correct, Denise. An is a fact, and an ought is a moral conclusion. That's right. The is stuff is what we logically think, like 1 and 1 are 2. All right, that's a logical fact. And the sky is blue is, when it's a cloudless sky in the daytime, is an empirical fact. It's an observation. So Hume would say those are both facts, right? Mathematical and logical facts come from our reason. He calls them relations of ideas. And impressions of the world that we get from our senses are empirical facts. And our moral sensibilities and our moral prescriptions do not come from either of those two sources. You cannot logically or empirically deduce an ought from an is. Okay? So facts cannot lead to, that's right, facts cannot lead to moral conclusions. But isn't moral conclusion subjective? Well, yes, but facts are not. And you see the problem, Denise? This is we're going to point to a deeper problem. He's not disagreeing with Hobbes. Hobbes is saying, yeah, morality is totally subjective. But Hume is saying something more devastating. He's saying not only is morality subjective, but it's not even rational, because you're not going to get it from your relations of ideas in logic or indeed from your factual scientific observations of the world. So he's really cutting it off. He's cutting off morality from traditional epistemology on both sides. Both rationalist and empiricist epistemology can never give rise to any kind of cogent moral reasoning. So that's why it's called a guillotine, pretty drastic. Let me give you a quick example of this. I mean, this usually provokes a lot of thought, because if you really understand what Hume is telling us, then it may turn some of you permanently into moral skeptics. But in any case, I'm not trying to do that. I'm not trying to convert you to anything. I just want you to understand how serious this is for any kind of moral theory, and why, therefore, Kant spent so much time trying to answer Hume. And that's really where we're headed this morning, right? So here's a quick example. Let me give you a statement of fact, okay? I think it's a statement of fact. Let's accept it. You tell me if you don't want to, but I think it's fairly factual to say the following thing. Here's an example of a fact. Thousands of abandoned and or abused pets are being cared for in animal shelters. Is that fair to say? I don't know the exact number, but we pretty much know from the news and from, local and national observations, right? That I'll repeat. We could consider it a fact, for the sake of argument at least, that thousands of abandoned and or abused pets are being cared for in animal shelters, right? As we speak today, this is happening, okay? So that is an example of a fact, right? An empirical fact. Okay, now here are two very different ought statements that are not being derived, Hume would say, from this is, because how could a certain fact give rise to divergent moral prescriptions? So here's one ought statement. In light of this fact about thousands of abused and abandoned pets being cared for, we could say, for example, we ought to raise money to help look after them. Right? Couldn't we say that? In fact, there are people trying to raise money to help look after them. It costs money to look after animals and to nurse them back to health and to find homes for them. They have to be boarded and cared for and fed and all of that until they're adopted, if they are, right? Some of them need medical care. It costs money for animals too. So one possible ought statement is, therefore, that we ought to raise money to look after them. Okay, that's an ought. But Hume will remind us that you didn't get this ought from the is, from the facts, because here's another ought, which may be some of you, it might strike some of you as horrifying, but it's just another ought statement. In light of this is, about all these pets being cared for, we ought to use them to feed hungry people. We have all kinds of hungry children in this country, more than ever. Isn't that another fact? And so we have all these animals that aren't really doing anything, and moreover are costing us a lot of money to feed and to care for, so we ought to use them to feed hungry people. Now, that's an ought. Yeah, yikes, that's right. It's another ought. But it's a totally different ought, isn't it? On the one hand, we ought to raise more, we ought to raise funds to care for these animals. On the other hand, we ought to use them to feed people who are obviously hungry. Why don't we turn them into food? So those are two morally divergent prescriptions, right? Let's take care of them on the one hand. Let's turn them into fast food on the other hand, because some people are hungry. Okay, so those ought statements obviously cannot be derived in any logical fashion from the fact of the matter, because a logical deduction cannot give rise to a contradictory state of affairs, right? It's not possible that 1 + 1 = 2 on the one hand and equals 3 on the other. In matters of logic, we can always identify, at least in principle, a right answer from a wrong answer. And in matters of observation, science is continually trying to identify sound from unsound theories about observations that are made. But in moral domains, says Hume, you can't derive anything from a state of affairs. Okay? Do you get the problem? And we'll do more examples in a moment. I just want to make sure you begin to see how really troublesome this is. Do I take this silence as a sign that you're seeing how problematic this is? Shall I interpret your silence as that you're dumbfounded now by what Hume has to tell us? I hope so. It's very shocking. Maybe you weren't prepared for it. But it is shocking, is it not? Yes, okay. So here are more examples, and then I'll cut to the chase. And what's in between the lines will become, I think, clearer to you. That is, between the lines of Hume's argument, when we look at a couple more examples. So let me return to the sharing. And this has, I'm telling you, a lot of traction in today's arguments. If you look at the politics of the U.S. And the underlying moral issues across the spectrum of issues that are on the table and are being debated, I think you will see very clearly that the left and the right are both drawing very different moral prescriptions from what is presumably the same state of affairs. I mean, that's a presumption. There's another problem, too, which I'll just address in passing. But let's look at more examples so we can see the extent of the reach of this argument. That's the point. So we'll go back to Hume for a moment. And you can all see this, yeah? So I'm now going to share some examples with you that I've cooked up a little beforehand. And here are some examples. Here's a similar problem about malnutrition. Here's an is statement. thousands of children are dying every day from malnutrition. This is unfortunately the case, and I think the United Nations World Health Organization estimates as many as 40,000 children a day. I mean, it's some astronomical number of children, and many, many countries are suffering from this, including our own. Unfortunately, thousands of children die every day because they don't have enough to eat. I mean, they're slowly starving to death, right? Okay, so what is the ought? Well, many people would say, therefore, we ought to make greater efforts to feed them. I mean, that seems an obvious thing to say. And then Hume is going to remind us, not specifically, but generally, that you could derive or attempt to derive a very different ought from this state of affairs. You also could say, therefore, since thousands of children are dying every day from malnutrition, those who cannot feed their families ought not procreate. In other words, people ought not to have children if they can't afford to feed them. And that's another ought statement. It may sound very callous to some of you, as it does to me, but there are people who would argue this, yeah? You see the problem? It's a parallel problem to the previous example about what do we do with all these abandoned animals, only we're talking about human beings who are potentially abandoned. Okay, example 2. Here's an is. Equal opportunity is desirable in a just society. I think that most people would agree that we want a certain kind of equality across the board in terms of opportunities. Certainly our society and many others have been predicated on that for a long time. Equal opportunity is desirable in a just society, but it does give rise to unequal outcomes. I mean, if everybody runs a race, not everybody wins, right? If everybody enters a job market or enters a career path, not everybody attains the same outcomes. So we see this constantly. If everybody enrolls in a university, not everyone studies the same subject, and not everyone has the same GPA. So you see that equal opportunities do give rise to unequal outcomes. So what ought you want to derive? Well, you could say, therefore, unequal outcomes should be socially engineered to make them more equal, right? That would be the social engineering moral prescription, that we ought to basically socially engineer. In other words, we ought to intervene in some way in order to make outcomes more equal. On the other hand, you could, from the same is statement, propose something quite different. You could say we should not, in other words, ought not, should, or ought are synonymous. Yeah, we should not tamper with unequal outcomes if we want to preserve individual liberty. So if you're going to start socially engineering things, you're going to end up interfering with individual rights in the process. So we ought not to tamper with the outcomes. So we have two different oughts. One is that we should tamper with the outcomes, tamper with the process to kind of fix the outcomes, and the other is we should not tamper with the process in order to fix the outcomes. Two completely divergent oughts, which are supposedly being derived from the same is, but what Hume is saying is you can't do it. That's why you get divergent oughts, because there is no rational derivation that can be made. Ought and is are in totally separate domains. Example 3, our planet is undergoing climate change. I think everybody agrees with that. That's certainly an is. I think it's observable and measurable in many ways. Okay. Ought. Well, you want to say perhaps this. Therefore, governments should take drastic legislative action, such as imposing carbon taxes. There are many kinds of things, the Paris Accords or whatever you want to come up with. Governments should take drastic legislative action, such as imposing carbon taxes, is an ought that is purportedly being derived from this is. On the other hand, you could just as well say, therefore, governments should carefully study all scientific findings to ascertain the precise extent of human impact on climate change before making new laws. Because, as you well know, our climates change anyway. Climate's always changing. So the question is just not whether it's changing or not. Everyone agrees that it's changing. But the question is, if the question is how much are humans impacting this, then only when we know that will we really know what sorts of laws would be appropriate. Okay? So again, two different oughts coming from the same is. And lastly, this one we're seeing, I concocted this example a couple of years ago before cancel culture started basically assassinating people's careers. So this example is even more trenchant than it was a few years ago, is some people are offended by other people's jokes, right? That's a statement of fact. Yeah, it's a matter of fact. Some people are indeed offended by other people's jokes. A joke might be funny to some people and offensive to others, right? That's how humor operates. Okay, so some people are offended by other people's jokes. And so what? So what ought we to do? Well, you could say, therefore, any joke that offends anyone should be prohibited, and the offender should be punished, and that's what we're pretty much seeing. On the other hand, you could say something different, which I do personally, but you don't have to agree with me. You could say, therefore, people should realize that they can never be offended against their will, and therefore ought to understand that their feelings are their own responsibility. In other words, nobody can offend you without your willingness to be offended. And so you ought to realize that if you take offense at something that someone says, it's not that what they said is offensive, it's that you chose to see it that way, and therefore they're not responsible, you are. And if you're not in charge of your mind, I just would ask you, who is? Who the heck is running your mind anyway? So anyway, those are two different oughts that could be derived from this state of, some people being offended, right? Okay? And those are, again, two really conflicting moral prescriptions. So in all of these examples, here's the big takeaway, and this is what Kant is responding to. In each of these examples, two contradictory moral prescriptions have been derived from one and the same fact. Each argument contains an implicit ought premise. This is what Hume is not telling you, and this is what I'm telling you, that each argument already contains another ought. There's another ought that's implied, which it needs to make its derivation work. So in other words, there's a step that's implicit in each of these arguments, which is not explicitly stated to you. But every time, says Hume, you're trying to derive ought from is, what you're really doing is you're deriving ought from another ought, from an is plus some other ought which is implicit. And you always need that implicit ought to derive an ought from. So you cannot derive ought from is, but you can derive ought from ought. And your exercise, if you want to try it at home, would be to supply the missing premises, the missing ought statements from each of these examples, which would then allow the derivation to make logical sense, but only if you stick another ought in there and derive your ought from an ought. Examples of that, let's go back to the first case where we have all these thousands of animals in shelters every day, right? We have all these animals being cared for. And if you want to assume that the lives of animals, we ought to regard the lives of abused and abandoned animals as equally important to humans. That's the key ought that allows you to say, therefore, we ought to raise money to look after them, right? And those of you who were sympathetic to that first claim about what we ought to do were also buying in to the implicit premise that we ought to regard animals' lives as of significant, if not equal, importance to our own, and therefore divert funds away from potentially feeding people and supply them to animals, right? That's the implicit ought. And so we're deriving this other ought, that we ought to raise money, from that implicit ought and not from the is. Whereas in the second case, when we say we ought to use these abandoned animals to feed hungry people, we're deriving that from a different implicit ought. Again, the is the same. The matter of fact is thousands of abandoned and abused animals are being cared for, but the different ought is the following one. If you assume that the lives of abandoned and abused animals are not as morally significant as the lives of people who need food and medical care, therefore it would follow that we ought not to raise money for these animals, rather that we ought to use these animals as a resource for feeding people, only because you're deriving it from the implicit ought premise that the lives of people, humans, ought to be regarded as more significant morally than the lives of these animals. And so that would justify your deriving the ought that we ought to feed them to people. Yes? So do you see that in both cases? The ought statement that we're actually stating as a moral prescription is not derived from is. It's not derived from a matter of facts. It's derived from another ought, which we already have in our minds. Is this clear to you? That's the vital point. So when Hume is saying we can't derive ought from is, I think he's correct, but he's also saying between the lines that we're really always deriving ought from another ought. It's a more fundamental ought we've already bought into as a result of our sentiments. That's where Hobbes comes into play. And so we derive oughts from oughts, and maybe from a combination of ises and other oughts, but never from is alone. Okay, is everybody all right with this? That's the fundamental problem of moral skepticism, in a nutshell. Are you all in shock? Are you okay? Talk to me. Everybody there? Yes, okay. As long as you're there. Well, Rachel says we all have to agree on the implicit aspect of is. Not quite, Rachel. We have to. We may all agree on what is the case, but we all will end up disagreeing on the implicit oughts that we're already carrying with us. So ought is not implicit in the is. Ought is implicit in our own hearts or minds, and when we see an is, we're already adding that implicit ought to condition the is to lead us to another ought about what we ought to do about it. But we're not deriving that ultimate ought as a moral prescription from the is alone. We're deriving the ought from a combination of an is and implicit oughts or prior oughts, which are already embedded in our moral consciousness. And that's subjective, of course. So we're really deriving ought from ought, and not ought from is. Is that clear? Okay. And now I'll give you a worse problem. I just, this is bad enough, because the problem of moral skepticism is still bothering philosophers today, and even after Kant, it's not resolved. Kant gives us the most brilliant attempted solution, and that's why we're looking at Kant. It's totally brilliant what he came up with. Ought are flexible? Of course they are, Denise. Oughts will differ from person to person. What we ought to do about something implicitly, explicitly, is going to differ from person to person. That's why we have conflict in society. Even though we all may agree on what is the case, what we ought to do about it is going to vary from person to person, because we're not deriving ought from is. We're deriving ought from earlier oughts that we're already carrying around with us. Yeah. So I hope you're beginning to think about the depth of this problem, and why he was an atheist. That's a different thing, Denise. Okay, not part of his moral theory. I just mentioned that to you in passing, obviously stuck in your mind, which is fine. Now I'm going to give you a worse problem, which didn't really exist to the exquisite degree it does today in Hume's day. In Hume's day, most people would buy into the distinction between ought and is. In other words, most people would agree that there are matters of fact, and they might disagree with Hume's theory of moral skepticism. But today we have a worse problem, and it compounds the original problem. It's because we don't even agree, we no longer even agree on is. If you think about it, or if you watch the evening news, let's say you watch CNN and Fox, and you look at two different accounts of what's going on at the southern border, you will see two very different versions of what is. Yeah? Just to give you one example. And we don't even any longer have fundamental agreements on matters of fact anymore. They've all been challenged. They're all being challenged. So facts themselves are being deconstructed. There are people out there who believe there are no facts, and that it's all a matter of opinion. So even this supposed objectivity that we possess about matters of fact is definitely being challenged by a different kind of skepticism. It's really a rational and scientific skepticism now. Yes, so in other words, even facts are being challenged. What are we supposed to do about the pandemic? Well, supposedly follow the science, right? Supposedly follow the science, but once again, what we get are two different versions at times, two contradictory versions of what we ought to do about the pandemic based on differing interpretations of what the science is telling us, right? So science is supposed to be factual, but there are different interpretations of those facts which keep changing. So even facts are no longer as solid a ground as they once were deemed to be. Although I must hasten to add, that's not going to help to resolve Hume's problem, because no matter how solid our factual ground may be, Hume is still telling us we can never derive aught from is. Right? And so that only compounds our difficulty in ascertaining what's factual. It does not in any way solve Hume's problem, but it even worsens Hume's problem in a certain sense, because if we no longer even agree on what the facts are in a certain case, then we have even less hope of understanding our implicit moral premises that we attach to those facts and from which we derive our explicit normative prescriptions. All right? So I hope you see that the situation today in some respects is not better than in Hume's day in terms of our inability to derive aught from is, but in some sense it's even worse because we no longer even agree on is. Do you remember that? Even Clinton said that. Some of you may not remember this, but I remember when Clinton was being impeached for lying to Congress about his sexual escapades with Monica Lewinsky and others. Clinton said one time on national television that the whole business about this impeachment, he said, depends on what the meaning of is. That's I'm quoting Bill Clinton. He said it depends on what the meaning of is. So even then, there was overt recognition by our sitting president that what could be a matter of fact would no longer be regarded as a matter of fact in the same way by all parties to the conflict, that they would each interpret matters of fact in order to suit prior dispositions, which is even worse than what Hume is proposing. Okay, I don't want to leave you in a depressed state. So let's go on to Kant's solution, okay? Does anyone have any more comment or question to make? And now we're going to see how Kant deals with this. Kant has a very original way and a very beautiful and elegant way of trying to resolve this problem. Whether you agree with it or not, I think you will hopefully feel at least impressed by what Kant comes up with here to answer Hume's problem. In any case, is that why Denise asks, is that why they say there's three sides of the truth? Side A, side B, and the truth. Well, Denise, I think it's worse than that. I think there are as many sides as there are people to perceive it. This is we think that there are at least two sides to every story. That's partly reflected in our judicial system, where you have in a case that comes to court, there's a prosecution and a defense, right? And each of them presents their side of the story, as it were. But that process is supposed to reveal, quote unquote, the truth to us. If you have two very, very different sides of a story being presented, it's meant not to perpetuate a conflict, but it's meant to reveal truth. Each side in its own way is going to tell us something important. And supposedly, a jury of one's peers would be able, in the end, beyond a reasonable doubt, to make some assessment of what they believe are the facts or the truth of the matter, right? So we've allowed self-interest to reshape our views. I'm afraid so, Aliana. That's a very clear and concise way of putting it. That self-interest is now even, in a certain way, filtering what is, or what we take for is. Yeah, and so there is no objectivity anymore. It's increasingly difficult to sustain, certainly in the arena of public opinion. Even what is the case. Some people who don't like certain facets of a given is will disregard them. Other people who don't like other facets of a given is will disregard them. We are each regarding as is what we feel comfortable with or what aligns with the narrative that we bought into. So we still can't get aught anyway. Remember, Hume's point is that they don't, Denise, that facts and evidence never lead to ought. In any case, even if we agreed on the facts and evidence, we wouldn't get to an ought. Okay? So that's Hume's problem in a nutshell. Any other questions or comments? And we're going to look at Kant now. Without doing this, I think that the whole point of Kant's ethics would really be lost on you, and that's why I've taken the time. So let me now go to Kant. I want you to digest this and spend a lot of time outside of class thinking about it. These are really important points for us. Let me now share with you the Kant reading. I'm still here. It's asking me. Whatever that means. Metaphysically, I'm going to share the screen again, and we're going to look at Kant's theory and how Kant attempts to resolve this very difficult problem that Hume poses to us. If I can find the application, it's easier said than done. That appears to be it. Do you all see this? Somebody please speak, because I'm out of the chat room now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so this is Kantian Ethics from your textbook. It's called Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. Kant is more difficult to read than Hume. He writes in a very obscure style of the day. You'll find him in here, Kantian Ethics, right, is part B of part 4, or section B of part 4, Ethics and Society. So I'm going to close that, and now we'll just look at the reading. So Kant wants to say something very important. And one of the things about Kant's ethics is that they pay no attention whatsoever to consequences. And this is, remember, deontology. We talked about this distinction, deontological ethics, such that in all deontological systems, the rightness or wrongness of an act does not depend or at all depend on the goodness or badness of the consequences. So it depends on something else. And Kant's deontology is really a meta-deontology. What he's going to do with this is not give us a set of principles that tell us the right thing and the wrong thing, but he's going to give us a test with which we can actually, if you like, subject any potential rule that we want to apply to. And therefore, by applying any potential moral prescription to this rule, which he calls the categorical imperative, we'll be able to see if it passes the test, then it's the right thing to do. If it fails the test, then if it passes the test, then it's a sound moral rule, and if it fails the test, it's an unsound moral rule. You'll see how this works in a moment, okay? Again, with examples. First, we look at the theory, and then we'll look at some examples. More on Thursday in my breakout group, and with your breakout groups, you'll hopefully be reviewing Kant and looking at the examples. But for today, I want to lay out this very important definition of the categorical imperative. I'll type that phrase in. This is his answer in a nutshell to Hume. This is how we can solve Hume's problem, Kant says, and how we can not succumb to moral skepticism. It's called the categorical imperative, or CI, and that is going to be the name of the meta-rule that Kant derives. Okay? So first of all, what Kant says we have to do is understand goodness, and he's very quick to give us a definition. It's sort of circular, but he says it is impossible to conceive anything at all in the world, or even out of it, which can be taken as good without qualification except a good will. So in other words, for Kant, goodness is not a byproduct of virtue, like it is for Aristotle, and goodness is not a pure form, like it is for Plato, and goodness is not merely something you like or dislike, as it is for Hobbes. Goodness for Kant is a good will. This is a very different thing, and it's a rational thing. And he reminds us, and this is a bit reminiscent of Aristotle, Kant says intelligence, wit, judgment, and other talents of the mind we may care to name, or courage, resolution, and constancy of purpose as qualities of temperament, are without doubt good and desirable in many respects, but they can also be extremely bad and hurtful when the will is not good. Right? So remember Aristotle's distinction between intellectual virtue and moral virtue, right? Telling us that someone is smart, for example, doesn't really say anything about their moral character. And Kant here is drawing a very parallel kind of scenario. He's saying that you may be extremely intelligent, but if your will is bad, it just means you can use your intelligence to do bad things, right? So it's not a mark of a moral character to be smart. And that would be true of any ability that nature may give you. You might be a great athlete. You might be a great musician. You might be a great performer. You might be great at making money. You might be great at doing all kinds of things. But Kant is very quick to say, but if your will is bad, then those things are not going to have good outcomes, right? Because if you engage your abilities and harness them to a bad will, you're going to end up being a bad and hurtful person, right? Irrespective of your particular abilities. So that's an important distinction, reminiscent somewhat of Aristotle's. And he had read Aristotle, he knew about this, and he agrees with it. But he's taking it in a different direction. Kant is saying that primarily goodness means a good will, as far as humans are concerned. So if you're a good person, it means you have a good will, which means you have good intentions, yes, which means you think well of yourself and others. And I think that this definition is circular, for sure. If you're saying goodness is a good will, aren't you defining goodness in terms of goodness? Yes. But can we also, with some hand-waving, appeal to common sense? I bet each and every one of you understands what goodwill means in some way. Is that fair to say? Fair to say? That you could tell the difference between a person of goodwill and a person of ill will or bad will? You could sense it immediately when you meet people. Sometimes immediately they radiate goodwill or they radiate ill will. Yeah? So I think that is comprehensible, if somewhat perhaps intuitive. All right, where does he go with this? He is going to go to a very important place and tell us that goodness is goodwill, and moreover, a moral character has got nothing to do with the outcomes of what the will brings about. Here is the next page. And this is really important. This is where Kant is a deontologist, right? Deontology, not teleology. Remember, deontology means a system of ethics which is not focused on outcomes, right? The nature of duty and obligation, exactly right. Deontology, this is what Kant is propounding to us. And he says, and it's highlighted for you, a good will is not good because of what it effects or accomplishes. In other words, the consequences are not the measure of goodness, but because of its fitness for attaining a proposed end. No, not because of any of those things dealing with ends. It is good, he says, through its willing alone. That is good in itself. So intentions are going to be very important for Kant, although we have in English this saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Have any of you heard that saying before? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So, often we intend to do good things, and we might end up it might end up having a bad result. But somehow when that happens, we don't feel so blameworthy because we know our intentions were good. Well, Kant is saying intentions are really supremely important. And if you have goodwill, then the consequences are really not important. You may disagree here, but Kant is certainly one to maintain that a goodwill is not connected, therefore, with the outcomes that it attains in the world, but rather with its inherent goodness of intention. All right. Now he takes up the concept of duty. And this is where it gets a little deeper. We will therefore take up the concept of duty, which includes that of a good will, exposed, however, to certain subjective limitations and obstacles. So he wants to give us a very clear distinction, and he does this beautifully in the next paragraph, between what he calls honesty versus prudence. So honesty, which would be the product of a good will, says Kant, honesty versus prudence, which is merely self-interest. And the behaviors of an honest person and a prudent person may at times appear the same, but their motivations will be very different. And the example he gives is of a shopkeeper. Okay, he gives the example of a grocer who does not overcharge his inexperienced customer. So in other words, you could send a child to buy a loaf of bread, and the grocer would not shortchange the child who may not count money very carefully. So you could send a child to buy from this grocer, and you know that the grocer will give the correct change to the child. Kant's point is that from that alone, from the fact that the grocer did not cheat the child, we cannot really infer whether the grocer was honest or merely prudent. Do you understand why? Because if the grocer is honest, then the grocer won't cheat a child, just out of the principle of honesty. But if the grocer is merely prudent, then the grocer is going to say, well, it'll be bad for me if I cheat this child, because if anybody finds out I cheated this child, then I'll get a reputation as being dishonest or being a cheat, and that will be bad for business, and therefore I won't cheat the child. But you see the difference? If the grocer's honest, it's done out of principle, without regard to consequences. If the grocer is merely prudent, it's done with regard to not costing future business, because of a reputation for dishonesty, and therefore it's done entirely with a regard to consequences, in which case, on Kant's view, this is not at all moral behavior. So prudence is not moral. Prudence is merely self-regarding. Is that clear? It's a very important point. Yeah? We clear about this? Good. Okay, Renee is clear. All right, that's fine. So there's a difference. So the behavior may be the same, and we may not know from the behavior alone whether this person is merely prudent or indeed honest. But Kant is saying that prudence is not moral. It's just self-preservative. Okay. So what he wants to point out is that we are always going to be tempted to transgress our duties, and he'll give some examples of this. Certainly, we're always going to be tempted out of prudence to transgress our duties at times and not follow moral principles, but nonetheless, Kant is going to appeal to us to follow moral principles, in particular one principle called the categorical imperative. And he, in this chapter 2, the extracts here, he discusses what it means for something to be imperative. And here, this first line is quite significant. Everything in nature works in accordance with laws. Well, Kant, now by the end of the 18th century, Kant has seen enough of the scientific revolution that has ensued, and particularly with Newton, to be very impressed with the laws of nature. We have had now physical laws, laws of chemistry, laws of biology, not quite yet. Darwin would be in another 60 or 70 years, 60 years, but they're already seeing at this time that nature, underneath all of the phenomena, appears to be obeying certain laws. And so Kant believes that nature is lawful. And therefore, a rational being, says Kant, has the power to act in accordance with our idea of law. So when we govern ourselves, we are also trying to come up with laws, and he sees this as a kind of imitation of nature. And this is the purpose of our wills, he says. Since reason is required in order to derive actions from laws, in other words, what we decide to do in life is going to be derived as action from the laws we think we are bound to obey, will is nothing but practical reason. It's a very important connection. And so the will is a power to choose only that which reason independently of inclination recognizes to be practically necessary, in other words, to be good, because if will is practical reason and the will is good, then it is practically necessary to do good. That's part of his deduction. So how do we do this independently of inclination? Well, we're going to do it by following the categorical imperative. And he goes on to discuss what these imperatives are, and he recognizes, and here he is going to begin to tackle Hume's problem by, of course, recognizing that moral imperatives are expressed by an ought, right, what we ought to do. But instead of this being not derivable from is, Kant is going to argue that it in fact is derivable not from a state of affairs, but rather from the categorical imperative. And this is the great gift. I'm going to give you examples of it momentarily, but first we're going to state it. He states it about 22 or 23 different ways in this essay, which is only 100 pages, 120 pages or so, but he will tell us also in the body of the essay that all the versions of the categorical imperative that he defines in slightly different ways are really all one and the same. So a categorical imperative, says Kant, would be one which represented an action as objectively necessary in itself, apart from its relation to a further end. So again, this is a meta-deontology. He's telling us that a categorical imperative is actually telling us that a certain act, in terms of a moral prescription, is objective, not subjective. So he is resolving Hume and Hobbes at one stroke here by trying to reassert the objectivity of moral action coming from reason, that is, the practical reason of the good will. So what is it? Just bear with me. I see you're being patient. You're following. Okay, let us now turn the page, and we'll get in a moment, to his categorical imperative. You should read all this for yourself. I'm not going to have time to cover it in great detail. But again, he repeats this: a categorical imperative, which declares an action to be objectively necessary in itself, without reference to some purpose, right, is therefore an apodeictic principle. Sometimes you'll see apodictic without the E. That means logically irrefutable, incontrovertible, cannot be refuted. And that's a different kind of imperative from, let's say, a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative says an action is good for some purpose or other. For example, you ought to eat regularly. That's what Kant would call a hypothetical imperative. Why? Because if you ought to eat regularly, it's telling you that is good for some purpose, right? In other words, maintaining your health and well-being. So that is not objectively necessary, because it is not without reference to an end. The purpose of eating is to satisfy an appetite and to maintain a state of nutrition. So that's called a hypothetical imperative, okay? And that's different. A categorical imperative is not with reference to any purpose. It's with reference only with following the objective necessity of the dictates of a good will. So what is it? We finally get to the point. He spends a lot of time justifying how imperatives are possible and what they are, and this you should read for yourselves, but I want to cut to the chase, and this is the rule, which tells us what we should or should not do in terms of all possible moral rules that we want to test. It's really quite ingenious. There is therefore, he says, only a single categorical imperative, and it is this: act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So a maxim is a rule, okay? Just a synonym. A maxim, I'll type that in. A maxim is a rule, okay? Or a precept. You know, a rule or a precept. It's just a synonym. So act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So let me give you an example, and on Thursday I will look at Kant's 4 examples with my group. Presumably you will review this in your breakout groups, but let's just take a quick example of this. And one of the examples that Kant gives is the example of lying, right? Lying. Okay? Now, is lying justifiable? That would be a question for Kant. Is lying morally justifiable, right? So Kant says this, and I'm going to ask you the same question. I'm going to come back to the screen now and show you how this works when we actually apply it in a real-life context or a real-world context. Act only on that maxim such that you can will it to be a universal law. We're once again going to distinguish between morality and prudence. Kant would say, for example, and does say, I can imagine certain times in life where you might think that you're better off telling a lie rather than the truth. I'm not asking any of you to truly confess this. I'm just saying in general, can any of you imagine examples in real life where you might be tempted to tell a lie? I'm not asking you to confess that you've told lies. Okay, I'm just saying you could imagine times when it might be tempting, right, to tell a lie, maybe to escape a difficult situation or try to dodge a difficult question. Little ones. Okay, Johnette, yes, very good. Little ones, right. We used to call them little white lies, right? That's sometimes what we used to call them. And meaning, okay, well, it's a small lie. Maybe I can get away with it. It's not so bad. When you don't want to hurt someone's feelings. Yeah, Denise, that happens all the time. Hey, if you're in a relationship, I'll give you, if your relationship partner says to you, how do I look? Right? Like you're dressed up to go someplace and your partner says, how do I look? Well, they're probably fishing for a compliment, right? They're probably wanting to hear that they look great, yeah? And maybe they look awful. But if you say the truth, oh, you look terrible, that's probably going to hurt their feelings, as Denise says, yes? Or lying to take a day off. Yeah, like I'm feeling unwell today, I'm not coming into work. Sure, all these little lies. So Kant is going to acknowledge, Kant is going to say to you, yeah. There are all these times in life when you might feel that telling a lie would be prudentially beneficial. In other words, might help you out in a particular situation. Okay? But here's the thing. Will lying pass the test of the categorical imperative? And here's the way you actually subject it to a test. There's a method for doing this. You can try this at home. You take the thing that you're about to do, namely telling a lie, and you ask yourself whether this maxim, in other words, that I should lie in order to save myself from some little problem or some bigger problem, whether I can will it to be a universal law. And this is a huge quantum leap from being willing to commit this, breach potentially of moral decency by telling a lie. And then asking the Kantian question is, could this be a universal law? What would happen to this maxim if it became a universal law? And the rule is as follows. If it would self-destruct as a universal law, then you yourself may not do it in your own particular situation. If it will not self-destruct as a universal law, then in fact it is indeed permissible for you to do it in your own situation. So let's specifically look at lying. If you were to will, as Kant urges us to do, whether lying would pass this test, imagine a world, this is a hypothetical world. So Kant, being a philosopher, wants us to conduct a thought experiment. Hang on, Melissa. So Kant wants us to conduct a thought experiment and say, what would it be like if the universe were governed by a universal law that said that everybody had to lie? Now, if it's a universal law to lie, it means that everybody is telling lies all the time and that everything that everybody says is in fact untruthful. That's what it would mean for lying to be a universal law. It's like gravity, right? It affects everything. And so lying affects everything. And if it were a universal law, everyone would be lying constantly. Kant's point is, if you can imagine a world in which everybody is lying all the time, because that's a universal law, would that work? In a hypothetical world where everybody was lying all the time because it's universal law to lie, would you be able to lie successfully? No, you would not be able to lie successfully. Why not? If lying were a universal law, why would it no longer work to lie? Well, because everybody would know you were lying because it's universal law. That's exactly right, Randy. If everyone is lying and you know it's a universal law to lie, then of course no one's going to believe you. And so the maxim self-destructs. The maxim that you're testing, namely, well, it's permissible to tell a lie, in a certain situation to save myself from an unpleasant consequence. If you allow lying to become a universal law, Kant says, it will fail to pass the test. It will self-destruct as a universal law. And therefore, the conclusion is that you must not lie because it fails the test of the categorical imperative. Do you get this? This is very brilliant. He's attempting he's attempting to conduct a thought experiment which once and for all will rule in or rule out the permissibility of doing something in our own lives. And actually, the only way interestingly and logically, in a world in which lying were a universal law, there would only be one way to fool people. And how would that be? In a world in which everyone had to lie all the time, no one would believe anything anybody says because they would all know, you would all know that, yeah, Rachel, excellent. The only way to really fool people would be to tell the truth because then they would think you were lying. But guess what? You're not allowed to do that because you're already in a hypothetical world in which there's a universal law to lie. So you wouldn't even be able to deceive people by telling the truth because the universal law would prohibit it. So do you see how the maxim self-destructs? The maxim that it's potentially, I ought to be able to tell a lie to save myself in a certain case. This self-destructs when subjected to the test of the categorical imperative. And so for Kant, it means that you must never lie. So it's very strict. Remember, this is like a very absolutist moral position. It's saying, well, if the precept that you're about to act on fails the test of the categorical imperative, it means you must never do it. And Kant lived like this. He walked the walk. He never ran for political office, so he didn't have to worry about what he was telling people when he was campaigning. But he, on the other hand, he was known to be a very truthful person. All right, let's take the test now with a different precept, just to give you a flavor of it, how it operates. Let's subject a different rule to this test. Suppose we ask the question of whether it's okay to steal. In other words, should we be allowed to take something that doesn't belong to us? Or maybe just shoplift a very small thing. I'm not talking about, rioting and looting. I'm just talking about maybe shoplifting a little bit. Put a small thing in your pocket and walk out of the store with it. Is that okay? So Kant would say, well, it may not be cool, Johnette, but we're going to do an objective thing with it. We're going to subject it to the categorical imperative. Remember, so if Kant wants to test the moral permissibility of a certain rule or a certain norm or a certain ought, in other words, ought I be permitted to steal only a small amount or to cheat on my income tax or, whatever, you want to subject it to the test. So how does that work? Let's imagine now, again, a universal law that everything is stolen. Let's imagine a world in which it's a universal law that everybody steals, right? That's the thought experiment. We take this precept, we make it into a universal law. Now, in such a world in which everything is stolen and everybody steals all the time, does this maxim logically preserve itself, that it's okay to steal? In a world where everything is stolen and everyone is constantly stealing, what does that look like? Well, Kant's answer is that in such a world, if everything is already stolen and everybody's constantly stealing, then there is no such thing as property. Just follow this, okay? In a world where everything is stolen, then nothing is owned, because everything by definition is stolen, because there's a universal law to steal, right? So nobody owns any property in such a world, because by definition, there's a universal law of theft. That means that everything is stolen. But if everything is stolen, then there's no such thing as property. But if there's no such thing as property, then, in fact, there is no such thing as theft. Because if nobody owns anything, it's impossible to steal. It's like a Hobbesian state of nature, where there's no right or wrong, right? In a Hobbesian state of nature, there's no property because there's no law. So in this hypothetical Kantian world where everything is stolen, there is no property because everything is by definition stolen and therefore it doesn't belong to anybody. And therefore, there's no such thing as theft. But if there's no such thing as theft, then the maxim breaks down. It's contradicted itself. If it were a universal law to steal, then in a sense, the notion of stealing would contradict itself. And therefore, the maxim self-destructs and fails the test of the categorical imperative. And therefore, says Kant, I may not steal, I ought not ever to steal, and I'm never justified in stealing, because the idea of taking something that doesn't belong to me, if it were to be a universal law, in this hypothetical world would fail the test of the categorical imperative. Note that other behaviors will pass the test. If we take one more example, I know we're almost out of time. Let's look at the example of truth-telling, the opposite of lying, right? Truth-telling. Let's say that I test this principle: should I tell the truth? Imagine now a world where everyone's telling the truth. So everything that everybody says is truthful all the time. That's the hypothetical world. Does that maxim self-destruct? Actually, it doesn't. There's no logical contradiction in a world where everyone is telling the truth all the time. There is no logical or objective self-destruction of that maxim. And so it becomes the right thing to do in Kant's terms, because it passes the test of the categorical imperative. So this is how Kant, just to summarize, you want to read this yourselves carefully to make sure you understand, first, Hume's guillotine and the terrible problem of moral skepticism that poses, and Kant's attempted resolution via the objectivity of the categorical imperative, which says, well, we can't derive ought directly from is, but we can certainly derive ought from the categorical imperative, which is a kind of a hypothetical is. Imagine a world where such and such is a universal law, such and such a moral behavior is a universal law. Does my maxim self-destruct or not? If the maxim does not self-destruct, then I can, in fact, derive what I ought to do from the matter of hypothetical fact in the world in which the categorical imperative is being tested. Okay? And that is Kant's attempted resolution of Hume's problem. Now, we've covered a lot this morning, and I've tried to give you the bare bones. It does require some thought and some further reflection on your part, both to appreciate what Hume is telling us and also to understand how Kant attempts to reinstate reason as the arbiter of moral precept. Kant is really saying we can, by rational means, solve Hume's problem, and therefore we can get rid of moral skepticism. Is that clear, at least in principle? The roadmap is clear to you? And Kant you need to read in more detail. He's not an easy philosopher to read. He writes a bit in an obscure way, but I hope this has been helpful to you. And in your breakout groups, you will be able to look more closely at the examples that Kant gives in his own text, and therefore hopefully get a handle on how to apply the categorical imperative. Is that okay for today? Is it more than enough? Okay, you're very welcome, Rachel. I'm glad it's getting clearer. This is a brand new thing, and it's very deep. We're going pretty deeply now into moral theory, which is a good place for us to be at this point in the course. So you're very welcome, all of you. I wish you a very happy day and a good week, a safe week, and I will look forward to seeing Section M on Thursday. And the rest of you, please continue with your study of Kant's moral theory this week. Next week, we cover the last philosopher in this section, John Stuart Mill, who's extremely important, and it's going to take us right into our current situation with what he has to propose. Okay? So be well, everybody, and I will be seeing you again soon. I'll stop the recording here.